Time to repeat this passive cooling test, but this time with the 4300 GE instead of the 4750G. Now, I'm actually going to try two things today. I'm going to try and test this with everything set on default, and then again with the boost clock turned off, to see if there's any difference at all in terms of heat and power consumption. I suspect there should be, but we'll just go and see. We'll just have to wait and see. I'm also, this time around, going to be using it with the iGPU turned on, which is different from last time. I turned it off last time because I didn't think it could handle it. But this time, since it's a lower power chip in general, it should hopefully do it, because the 4300G used about 20 watts less than the 4700G anyway, so hopefully we should be able to have both turned on today and get some nice results. So before we get started, let's remind ourselves how this went last time. And if you remember rightly, it got very, very hot. The CPU ended up sitting around 92 degrees, which is a bit too high for prolonged use. The bigger concern was the motherboard was sitting about 80 degrees, which was probably due to the extra power consumption of the chip, and obviously no airflow or anything like that around the VRMs. That you would not want to leave at that temperature for prolonged use, because that would kill your board. So before I start, the ambient temperature in here was about 24 degrees, and I'm using some just generic cheap thermal paste, you know, about £1 a whole tube. It's terrible stuff, but this is kind of the worst case. It gets worse, so this is kind of not the best thermal paste, but it'll give you an idea of if this is feasible or not. It's also worth pointing out that this board in particular, or different from the other one, has not got any heat sinks on the power distribution part of the motherboard, so it's completely exposed. So I'm expecting the heat to be worse this time, but we'll just have to wait and see again, though this is drawing less power, so it might be about the same. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's start off with some CPU benchmarks. Let's start off with classic CPU Z. Here we get some slightly mixed results. It's a little weird, but this is mainly due to throttling. Just as a baseline, the 4350G scored 2612. The active version with the Noctua fan on top scored 2752. Passive, all on stock, scores 2513. Though when I ran a stress test, it dropped straight down to about the 2000 mark. So there's some severe throttling going on here because of the extra heat being generated by that boost clock. But when I ran it with passive with no boost clock, it sat at a solid 2354. So we actually got slightly better performance overall from the no boost clock version, just because it didn't have to keep going up and down and keep throttling itself. It was able to hold that temperature. In Cinebench R23, I haven't got the original numbers, but let's compare the 4300G active to passive. Active, we score 5985, which is a pretty good score. Passive, we score 5562, which is not bad, but it's obviously slower. And with passive no boost, it scores 5242. So worse off, of course, but there's no boost clock there, and we saw a slightly lower power consumption, which I'll get onto in a moment. Now in Final Fantasy 15, a little odd here, but you get that with game benchmarks sometimes. Active, we scored 2431. In passive, we scored 2388, and in passive with no boost, for some reason, we scored 2440, and all of those run over 1 hour, and it chooses the average from all the runs and gives you a result. So that's interesting in its own right. But of course, always take game benchmarks with a pinch of salt, especially when the numbers are this close. Now it's a similar story with TimeSpy. Once again, I've got the 4350G here just as reference, that it was using slower RAM, so it's just there for reference. The passive scored the best, very, very close to the active. Passive no boost obviously scored the worst. But once again, when the numbers are this close, you can't really draw that much conclusion from it. but though the passive no boost you'd expect to be slightly lower. Now, Wildlife gives some very odd results. Once again, the numbers are very close to each other, but the passive no boost, for whatever reason, scores best overall. And I ran these tests multiple times just to make sure, and I took the average. So the passive no boost scores the best, with passive scoring very close. And for whatever reason, active is quite low. No idea why. And obviously the 4350G bringing up the rear with that slower RAM. So not entirely sure what happened there. One of those odd cases again where benchmarks don't really tell the full story. Firestrike gives more of a expected result. Once again, ignore the 4350G. Active scores the best, passive slightly lower, and passive no boost quite a bit lower. So that's more about where we expect it to be. And it's the same story in Night Raid. Active is the best, passive is roundabout a little slower, and the passive with no boost is well down the bottom. I'm guessing because Night Raid and Firestrike are slightly older, it's more CPU bottlenecked rather than GPU. Not entirely sure, but it would kind of explain the results. Point is, they're kind of similar. They're not a million miles away from each other. Now with power consumption, I did my typical readings where I took an idle reading and I monitored the wattage meter to see when it peaked and wrote down the peak. And I have the average 1 hour Final Fantasy 15 test as well to try and give us an average over the course of an hour. So, the idle on both the non-boost and the stock of the GE is 19 watt, which is pretty impressive. No surprise, since that lower base clock should make a difference, and it makes a difference about 5-6 watts, which is pretty good. That can add up over the course of the year if the machine runs idle a lot. Which hopefully it shouldn't, because at that point you should get to sleep. For CPU-Z, the 4300GE and the 4350G scored an exactly the same 57 watt peak, and that was during the multi-core test. The no boost version scored no higher than 40. I ran that a couple of times to make sure that was correct. So that's a saving of 17 watts, which is huge, just by turning the boost clock off. It's a similar story with Cinebench. The 4350G pulls 72 watts at peak, the 4300GE pulls 67, and the 4300GE pulls 48. Now I will say that that was Cinebench R20 for the 4350, so not directly comparable, but between stock and no boost, once again, that's quite a big drop. Of course, they're both CPU based benchmarks, so that's not a shock that you see such a big drop just by turning off the boost clock for the CPU. Moving on to Firestrike, the iGPU is the same speed throughout all these tests. So the 4350G pulls 57, the 4300GE pulls 56, and with no boost it pulls 54. So a very slight saving there when doing gaming related stuff. And that trend is identical when it comes to the 1 hour Final Fantasy 15 benchmark, whereas the 4350G pulls 58, 4300G pulls 54, and the no boost pulls 53, so it only saves about 1 watt over the course of an hour. Enough about that. Let's have a look at what the actual heat was. 4300GE, we're getting 93 degrees on the CPU in the Firestrike constant looping of the CPU test. But interestingly, which is a surprise to me, the motherboard was reporting 39 degrees. Now, I thought that was wrong. So I got the thermometer out. I measured all the way across the board to find the hottest part. And the hottest part I could find was 67.5, which is over the VRMs. So the motherboard temperature is slightly wrong there. So that's pretty good. Once again, it's a bit hot, but I'm much happier with those motherboard temperatures. So I think you could run that at a prolonged period. So how does that compare with the non-boosted version? Well, I let it run for around about the same amount of time, a few minutes less, but the temperature had stayed stable for about 20 minutes. It hit about 66, 67 degrees, with the motherboard hitting around about the same temperature, about 38. So that is massively lower than what it was with the boost clock. So based on those figures alone, it looks like it's feasible to actually cool this CPU passively as long as you turn the boost clock off. So in conclusion, well, this is running pretty hot to the touch. With no boost clock, this is a far more manageable temperature, and enclosing this in a case, I can't see any issues running that passively at all, which is far better than what the 4750G did. Now of course you could pair this with a GT 1030 and get better game performance. It would also drop the temperature of this as well. So I think this is perfectly feasible to passively cool this CPU. I still think it's an absolute stretch to call this a 35 watt TDP I still think this is an absolute stretch to call this a 35 watt TDP CPU, considering that the performance is almost identical to its 65 watt brother. So how they can claim it, I don't know. Marketing mumbo jumbo, more than likely. I would class this as a 45 watt TDP CPU, with the 4350G being about 58 or 55 anyway. So it's not 35 watt. I wish it was. Now you might say that at the non-boosted clock that it is 35 watt and that Intel does the same, and you'll be correct. But with Intel's offering, at least they tell you what the boosted TDP rating is, and it's normally around about 43, 48, depending on what the CPU is. So at least they tell you that. You might have to dig for it and have a look around, but that information is available online. And from another interesting point of view, if I whacked a 1030 against this and left it at its default clock speed, it would be pulling about 100 watts, this machine. Maybe a little less, maybe about 90, which is more than what the Intel equivalent does, because my daily driver machine is an i5 Ivy Bridge T processor, which is 35 watt, with a GT 1030 and 4 SSDs. And that machine only draws about 80 watt at peak. And I know this because the PSU never spins, and that will spin when the machine draws 90. I wouldn't be able to say that for this machine. It's the exact same configuration, just because the CPU itself is definitely pulling more than 35. But if you remove the GT 1030 and just have this as is, the power consumption of this machine is phenomenal for what you get in terms of performance. It's not as fast as a GT 1030, and it's not as fast as, let's say, an i7 7700, but it's not far off. And for a chip that only costs around about 120 quid, depending on where you get it and which version you get, you can't go far wrong. Granted, RAM and boards are a little bit expensive at the moment, but it's an amazing little machine. You can even buy bare bones machines where you can just whack the CPU in and the RAM, and obviously your hard drive, and away you go. So all in all, I'm going to see if I can make a passive machine out of this, get a nice case, smaller board, it's a nice bit of RAM, that kind of thing, and see what we get. I probably won't be featuring any more of these Ryzen CPUs for a while. I've kind of done everything I want to do with these CPUs. So this is the last video on that series. This might pop up in a later video when I'm looking at replacing my daily driver. It's either going to be this CPU or a Skylake i5. We will see. But stay tuned for that. You know, like, dislike, leave a comment and subscribe below. And thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. So until then, goodbye.